On the evening of July 15, 2023, in Lacrosse, Wisconsin, Dylan, a 26-year-old man, was driving his friend home after a fun-filled day at the Riverfest festival. However, their trip was abruptly interrupted when Dylan, instead of focusing on safe driving, decided to zoom through a red light right in front of a police officer. Soon after, his vehicle was pulled over by law enforcement, marking the beginning of what would become a comedy of errors. What initially seemed like a simple traffic violation quickly spiraled into an unpredictable situation, with Dylan, known for his ongoing confrontations with the police, turning the incident into an all-out spectacle. This was no ordinary traffic stop, and Dylan was no ordinary driver. A quick glance at his record would surprise anyone, as his criminal history seemed to be a collection of bold and diverse offenses, from daring thefts to heated confrontations with law enforcement, and even resisting and assaulting officers. Dylan had practically become an expert at challenging laws and regulations. For him, breaking the law wasn't an isolated or rare event, it was part of his everyday life. Whether it was a way for him to assert his identity or simply because he felt life had no boundaries to restrain his desires, Dylan's behavior seemed to defy reason at every turn. When it came to following road signs or obeying warnings on the street, Dylan was clearly not the type of person to abide by rules. Simple instructions, like stopping at a red light or yielding to pedestrians, meant nothing to him. To Dylan, these signs might as well have been silent, meaningless markers. And the red light, rather than a warning, was a challenge to him. Thus, running the red light without a second thought was just another routine part of his lifestyle. However, what truly took everyone by surprise was Dylan's reaction when the police instructed him to stop. Instead of simply pulling over and cooperating like any other driver, Dylan displayed a surprising talent that few would have expected. Not only did he fail to stop right away, but he also reversed his car into a nearby parking lot, seemingly thinking this maneuver would help him avoid the police's scrutiny. The entire situation resembled a farce, with Dylan casting himself in the role of the cunning mastermind, trying to outsmart the system with ease. But reality soon proved otherwise. Dylan failed to realize that in a situation like this, slowly maneuvering the car or reversing into a parking lot was far from a clever strategy. It only raised further suspicion from the police. His actions, far from making the officers reconsider, only heightened their resolve to arrest him. Every move he made, whether big or small, highlighted his lack of cooperation and clear defiance. In fact, his behavior only made the situation more tense and complicated, not less. From this scenario, we can see that facing the law is not something one can simply avoid or skirt around. Dylan, no matter how clever he thought he was, could not escape the inevitable truth. No one can remain above the law forever. Defying regulations doesn't just cause more trouble, it leads to even more severe consequences for the offender. In life, patience and cooperation are often the keys to resolving difficulties more smoothly and efficiently. These details not only reveal the humor in the situation, but also underscore a bitter irony. Sometimes, the smart moves we think we're making only lead to the opposite result. Dylan believed he was outsmarting the rules, but in truth, he was only exposing his ignorance and lack of foresight. The lesson here is clear. Trying to circumvent systems or rules through unreasonable means often makes the problem more complex and harder to resolve. As the officers approached the car on that late evening, they didn't need any specialized training in intoxication or crime to immediately recognize that Dylan was in an obviously impaired state. For experienced officers, it wasn't difficult to spot the telltale signs: his bloodshot eyes, a telltale sign of intoxication, and his overall appearance, which reflected a complete lack of control. Dylan's eyes, red and bloodshot, as if stained by the lingering traces of alcohol, were not a sign of fatigue but rather a reflection of an endless nightmare. They didn't convey the alertness expected of a driver. Instead, they mirrored the dazed state of someone just waking up from a deep, haunting slumber, while the dim streetlights only made his face seem more ambiguous and confusing. It wasn't just his eyes, his entire body was a testament to his state of disarray. His staggering movements and heavy, disjointed gestures suggested that he could no longer control himself. Each motion revealed a sense of confusion, as if every part of his body was rebelling against his mind's struggle to stay alert. The unmistakable smell of alcohol, a signature of reckless abandon, permeated the air, blending into Dylan's breath and making the atmosphere around him suffocating. The stench of alcohol was so overwhelming that one could almost feel it not just by inhaling, but as if it had seeped into every cell of his body. This smell wasn't just a sign of drunkenness. It also symbolized his defiance and his determination to persist in his misguided decisions that night. In the quiet of the neighborhood, everything seemed to freeze. The only sound was Dylan's labored breathing and the stern gaze of the officers, who knew this wasn't just a traffic violation. It was an act that defied not only the rules, but also his own self, someone trying to escape responsibility and truth by drowning in the intoxication of his own defiance. When the officers directly asked about his condition, Dylan, with an air of arrogance, confidently denied, perhaps clinging to a self-deception he was desperate to maintain. "I haven't been drinking, really." Dylan's denial was not only unconvincing but also full of contradictions, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. His bloodshot eyes, the strong odor of alcohol around him, yet Dylan insisted, firmly closing his mouth and insisting he was sober. Worse still, instead of staying silent to undergo the test, he bizarrely questioned, "Why do you think I'm drunk?" This question was not only irrational, but a clear challenge to the officers, as if Dylan believed that he, and only he, had the right to determine his own state of sobriety. His question revealed not just a lack of self-awareness, but an arrogant disregard for the situation at hand, as if he believed everyone around him was wrong. Dylan's unfounded confidence, along with his irrational actions and words, created a scene that was both hilarious and deeply tragic. The more he tried to justify himself, the further he backed himself into a corner, unable to conceal the undeniable truth that he was completely drunk. However, instead of recognizing this and cooperating, Dylan continued to deepen his denial, proving that in moments like these, self-deception can often overpower reason. The police couldn't help but notice Dylan's bloodshot eyes, which clearly showed signs of disorientation and lack of control. These were eyes without focus, reflecting a mind shattered by the effects of alcohol. Under the dim yellow streetlights of the empty road, those eyes seemed like a mirror reflecting chaos, as if a broken glass was slowly fracturing. The officers sensed that those eyes were a vague warning Dylan wasn't just intoxicated, he was lost in his own world. A glance of disappointment flickered across their faces. They wanted to say something, as if by instinct, "You're talking to yourself, buddy." But instead of words, there was only silence, a heavy silence that enveloped the space. The feeling of helplessness crept into their hearts, as Dylan's actions were not only wrong but also incredibly baffling. Every word he spoke, whether nonsensical or confrontational, showed a man swimming against the tide, in the ocean of his own making, completely unaware of where he was. Dylan, like a rudderless boat, drifted aimlessly through the dark night, uttering disconnected lies. His words weren't just fragments of truth, but desperate attempts to deny an undeniable reality. The officers realized that he was no longer sober man facing the consequences of his actions. He was a drunk man, completely disconnected from reality. And in that moment, they understood that not all drunk individuals simply lose control. Sometimes, they lose the ability to recognize the truth, and that disorientation is a form of guilt that is much harder to cure. By refusing to cooperate, Dylan not only made the situation more tense, but also unwittingly triggered a chain of unbelievable events, causing everything around him to descend into chaos. When the officers asked him to submit to a breathalyzer test, instead of simply complying by blowing into the device, Dylan turned this moment into a performance full of confidence, but utterly foolish. He stood upright, staring directly at the officers as if they were the most unreasonable people in the world, making the night air seem heavier. His gaze, a mixture of arrogance and contempt, made the officers nearly reconsider whether they were the ones being misunderstood. "I'm not blowing into that thing," Dylan said definitively, his voice echoing in the quiet night, filling the space with undeniable defiance. "I haven't had a drop of alcohol." His words made him seem like the only sober person on earth, even as his bloodshot eyes and heavy breath betrayed him completely. His resistance grew more and more absurd, as if he was performing in a play or only he understood the script. The police didn't know what to do with a man who considered himself the center of the universe, other than patiently repeating the request, while Dylan, with his dismissive attitude, continued to repeat his unreasonable excuses. Each word, each movement he made seemed to add to the chaos that was already created. turning this situation from a mere traffic violation into a clear illustration of an arrogant attitude and willing to admit fault. Not stopping there, when the police requested Dylan to step out of the car for a physical test, he seemed completely unaware of the severity of the situation. For him, this was no longer a matter of compliance or cooperation, but a power struggle, with the car seat as the last fortress he would occupy. The image of Dylan frozen in the seat like an unfeeling rock, unmoving, could make one feel that he was trying to avoid the rules that life was forcing him to face. His messy hair, bloodshot eyes from intoxication, and heavy breath from the rising effects of alcohol all represented a man swept away by an emotional storm, to the point of losing any awareness of facing the truth. Instead of complying with the officer's request, Dylan decided to hold his ground, as if the car seat was his only weapon to protect himself from what he didn't want to face. He spoke firmly, each word sounding like an unchangeable decree. "I'm not getting out. Leave me alone." His words were not only illogical, but also conveyed a sense of stubbornness and desperation, a man not only rejecting the truth but also building a solid shell to protect himself from the surrounding impacts. That attitude was not a resistance to the police but a manifestation of fear and loss of control, as he realized his life had completely deviated from its course. From a psychological perspective, this action could be understood as a defensive mechanism of Dylan, a person who had experienced many failures and legal violations. He wasn't just trying to protect himself from punishment. He was also hiding the profound sense of helplessness and confusion within him. It's hard for a person to accept being a failure while still needing to project an image of strength to the outside world, even when reality no longer allows for it. Dylan's firm tone was merely the last layer of defense, holding on to avoid being completely crushed by life. But at this moment, Dylan was also facing a truth he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried to hold his ground. The truth and the legal consequences were inevitably closing in. The car seat, which he thought was a safe haven, was actually just a symbol of avoidance, a means to prevent him from confronting the harsh reality that awaited him. Meanwhile, the officers, though seemingly patient at first, could no longer remain silent in the face of this standoff. Pulling Dylan out of the car was no longer a simple act of law enforcement, but had turned into an unbelievable performance, as if they were participating in an action movie scene. The police couldn't help but realize that Dylan was trying to turn a normal situation into a fierce battle, where the truth was simply that he had violated the law and needed to face responsibility. But instead of doing what was right, Dylan fell into the trap he had created for himself, turning himself into a hero in a film that only he could understand. Eventually, Dylan was arrested for charges such as obstructing law enforcement, assaulting an officer, and violating bail conditions. He seemed unaware that his troublemaking only made matters worse. And as the final act of this adventure, Dylan was taken to jail, where he began arguing once again, this time with the officers in the detention center. Though he might have been an optimist in trying to escape punishment, Dylan had to learn a hard lesson that when reality hits you, sometimes the price you pay is much more than just a traffic ticket. In the end, after an endless argument, Dylan was forced out of the car and arrested on serious charges, including obstruction of justice, assault on an officer, and violating bail conditions. While Dylan might have thought he could escape every situation by opposing and playing tough, the outcome was that he faced a much harsher sentence than a simple traffic fine. The lesson to be learned from Dylan's story is that defying the law and stubborn behavior only leads to worse outcomes. Complying with the rules, especially when dealing with the police, not only protects yourself, but also helps keep the community safe. Resistance may bring a fleeting feeling of victory, but in the long run, it's just a road leading to unnecessary legal trouble.